weird sort of serendipity occurred with this book. One that ties in with my recent discussions and the book I just talked about earlier today, The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. This one is an Orson Scott Card book, and I'm a fan of Card. I find his stories compelling, often with some very clever twists in them. Unlike his science fiction and I guess fantasy type stuff, he's got stuff that's somewhere in between in the line, I think, more than, you know, it's not, he doesn't do the swords and sorcery type fantasy by any means. But he does do some stuff that feels sort of fantastical. This is sort of a modern, homeland defense fantasy. It's set in a very near future at the time he wrote it. And I think this also, I said the other one was 2006. I think this one, I'm not sure that one was. I think this one is, yeah. This was a 2006 book. And there's some veiled references to the president who's assassinated in it, and his main competitors seem like W. Bush and Hillary. Kind of veiled, you know, in the sense that, like, they're not clearly, obviously, you wouldn't want to talk about assassinating an actual person. So that never fits into it. But it's very, very much drawing on that kind of background. And you would say, it is as if he's writing about the current president and the current political situation in a lot of ways. The book is set in, you know, the hyper-polarized world that was already there in 2006, right? Where the, you know, the Iraq War especially was being criticized heavily and rightly. But the character that you focus on in this book, at least at first, there are a number of characters that it bops around their point of view, is, you know, sort of this military Superman type, you know, special forces. And it really, the other main male protagonist, and his wife are the three characters whose point of view you get from the story. And he and the other male main protagonist and his whole group, they're all special ops like Superman, you know, and really, yeah, you know, I mean, this is the kind of thing that you feel like would make a great action movie. Watched Bill Maher. He did a hell of an indictment of, you know, how well we fetishize and idolize the, you know, shooting off lots of rounds and doing heroic things with guns in our movies, and Kellyanne Conway pointed out in video games as well. And yeah, I totally agree. And you know, there's kind of the what do you do about that, but that, fuck man, that's part of the problem, right? But anyway, it's not John Wayne's, you know, it's funny, I watched, Kirk Douglas, I believe, an old interview with him, where, you know, he was mentioning John Wayne movies were family entertainment. You didn't see a lot of blood and gore. You didn't see, the violence was there, but it was kind of sanitized and everything. And that Wayne had, like, really spoken out against Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch, which incidentally is one of my favorite movies. But largely because everybody dies, you know. Anyway, let's get back to this one. The storyline is, I mean, it's grounded in that reality, and a reality that feels like it is today too. But some of it doesn't ring terribly true to me. Now, that may be my own biases showing through, but the concept of a Soros-like figure, and this is really part of it, who, behind the scenes assembles what is basically a military takeover by the liberal left. And not using the army, though, using his own little private army that he creates or whatever. This is way far-fetched from my view. That's the piece that I find just, I'm not saying that that there might not be a liberal violent reaction, but I don't see it coming along those lines at all. That just really, really doesn't seem reasonable to me. Now, I said there's some serendipity here. The reason I say that is I've been having these thoughts on my mind about the hyperpartisanship for a long time, but in terms of wanting to bring them to camera for a couple months at least, and really it was about that time when I started to realize, the center doesn't have the answer, right? And that's kind of the problem, is that the center has failed, and that only the fringe views, and that's in my America Fuck 2 video. The thing that I left out of the first one, and that I think is actually pretty damn important, is that the center's, the bargain, the cooperation, whatever, a shared consensus, hasn't worked. It hasn't worked for enough people that it's caused these violent backlashes. It caused, after the 2008 financial meltdown, it caused the Occupy Everything movement. It caused the Tea Party. And things have been spiraling, just more and more. The wheels came off there, and now we're just like skidding over the cliff or something. I don't know. But yeah, one of the things that is kind of built into this is that there's this fear of a right-wing sort of militarist takeover. I also consider that to be highly questionable. So while there are a lot of people in the military who are definitely more right-leaning, in a sense, support for the military has for so long been sort of a right-leaning position point, that there is that ideological basis in a lot of your officer class, and definitely over in the enlisted class. However, whenever they get sort of tested, the military seems to hold its ground. It might be put in an impossible position where doing nothing is essentially succumbing to a coup, but it would have to do nothing. But I don't think we're ever going to see the military coup type situation, at least not in the near future. I think that also is a fantasy. Now, that doesn't play out in this book, but the threat of it is a big deal. The threat of it and how that impacts, how that sort of drives the liberal coup attempt that's covered in the book. Now, what's particularly, in this story, what's particularly interesting is they set it up so that, I haven't talked about the serendipity well enough yet. Let me get back to that, damn it. My poor mind is such a scattered place. Yeah, so the serendipity of this is, I have read this before, I'm pretty sure. I may have bought this copy, or I may have another copy of it kicking around, but it didn't stick in my mind the way other card books probably would. So I was looking at this, and there were things here and there that I vaguely remember from, maybe 7 years ago or so when I went on a card binge, but the main storyline didn't really fit. But I had sort of this, oh, I see who's behind this, and the clues are being left there throughout. But the neat twist to this is the I see who's behind this doesn't fully get played out ever. You get left at the end of the story still saying, geez, was he the master manipulator pulling all the strings? There's questions that are unanswered. It doesn't wrap everything up at the end. And I find that kind of refreshing, actually. Because the reality of life is often not all loose ends are tied up. And this is telling the story from a few people's point of view, and they don't know, and you're never given insight into the one person who does perhaps know. And the theory or the thread that's following that, damn it, I keep failing, don't I? All right, the serendipity part, damn it, is that this fit in so well with some of the things I'm looking at, especially the hyperpartisanship, the center not holding and whatnot. Yet, it was really just the book that was on top of my stack, or stacks, that I was like, I like card. And I thought, when I looked at it, I thought, I picked this up out of one of the little free libraries, didn't I? That's why it's up on the top. And I think that's actually the case. And although if that is the case, I have another copy of it somewhere. And let's just read it, And I read things so quickly when they're not, like the Friedman book took me forever. Histories, non-fictions and stuff, I wade through them so slowly. But something like this that's well written, Card is a fucking master storyteller. He's not a word crafter. It's not like, now I can't remember. Well, we'll put it aside. But anyway, it took me like 2 days to read it. And the amount of time that I decided, well, I got to do the Friedman one before I finish this. And now I'm done with this, and it's in the same day. But anyway, that's the serendipity side of it. But let's go to the thread of the story. So the thread of the story is the one thing that ties everything together and seems to fit with it, is there's this one professor who kind of drops hints to people and sets up connections, but then the people that are eventually contacted are never really told what he tells them, which is that they'll drop his name. And they end up doing things which result in the assassination of the president, the seizure of power, in certain key locations, New York City mostly, by this, high-tech army. They're going around in mechs, basically, right? Against modern weaponry. And they have an EMP ray that can knock planes out of the sky, so the Air Force isn't a problem. So they're able, with a fairly small force, to start causing some disruption. But it's really kind of a question of, well, you're not going to grab the whole U.S. this way? So all you're going to create is a mess. Which kind of, that's another hole in the story, is that this liberal revolution or whatever it is, it doesn't have a clear goal. It just seems sort of like yeah, it's going to bust the U.S. up and turn it into maybe a bunch of little states, or else the army will go in and fucking kick its ass, because the army's big enough to do that, and this small force couldn't hold out against the full force of the army, but maybe public opinion would turn so much against it that things would just collapse in terms of the right, the more conservative side of things. But yeah, this guy just sort of seems to cause things, and he causes the protagonist to develop the plan to assassinate the president as a means of defending against the things that we hadn't thought of yet. He causes somehow or another, and this is, clearly accused by the Soros type character. It causes this liberal billionaire to sort of turn towards doing something, and it causes the original main protagonist, who gets killed in it actually, which is kind of cool. Ends up, like I said, developing the plans for killing the president, but he's also on the side, through things that he thinks this professor has set up initially, developed been shipping weapons and materials that are the ones for this Soros-like character, right? And a general who kind of fakes staging a coup from the right and the military that causes all of this to go into effect as well. Well, after the assassination, he's staging it, or threat, kind of telegraphs that he's staging one. He has also been contacted in that sort of way, and is linked into this whole thing. He's a pawn of the liberals there. Somebody within the White House is also a pawn of them. There seem to be connections all over the place, but none of it gets actually resolved. The only thing that gets resolved is that this liberal conspiracy, revolution, coup, I don't know what the hell to call it, gets put down. And, the other male protagonist is a hero, and this professor gets basically elected president by a bipartisan, he runs as the nominee of both parties. Again, would that be possible? I don't know. But his views, or at least the views that he has laid upon the first protagonist in the course of some classes that this guy, who was already in the military, already a special ops guy coming out, being groomed for a better position, for a more important role, by being put through a PhD program, where this professor teaches a few classes for him. This professor sort of extols that and this is what's really neat, that it aligns. But again, I've read this before, so who knows how much connectivity I'm getting on it. But he links where America is now not to the fall of Rome, but rather to the fall of the Roman Republic. That, we haven't even entered our imperial stage yet. But the interesting thing is, you're not sure if he wants to be emperor. Everything seems to lead that way, everything points that way, but they can't quite nail it down, right? It's all hunches and guesswork, and, what would happen after 2 terms? would he overturn the Roosevelt rule or whatever? I don't know. Anyway, I just found it incredibly interesting that this linked in there. I can't recommend Card enough. I think he's an amazing author who tells these really, really cool stories for an action. This one, so the problem is he goes into a wider positioning. You know, he's willing to range off into speculation a lot more than other authors often are, and there's always these twists and turns to things, you know, like if you've, with Ender's Game, what they're actually doing in their training classes is just, you know, that's the big twist there, but there are twists and turns throughout. Songbird had serious ones in it, others that I've read. Almost everything has these sort of plots within plots. And they're very, very well designed and developed, and the writing itself is good, and you know, it's not fine literature. It's good reading, you know, good comfort reading. One of the things that's interesting, so Card's own views, he gives an afterword of the whole thing, and he expresses some of his own views, and he's relatively centrist, maybe a little bit more right-leaning than left, but overall, you know, I would put him as maybe an old-school liberal type, right? Not American liberal, but 19th century, or something along those lines, which is fairly conservative, to tell you the truth. He uses some weird terms that show more right bias than others. But where he really kind of showed it was when he was describing some of the thoughts of his first protagonist. That I thought was his original view, which is kind of funny, and I'm not sure it's not. He seems more reasonable in his afterword than he did projecting things from the point of view of the character. And the point of view of the character was kind of along the lines of, well, I'm not one of those lunatic fringe right type people, but then some of his views seem close enough aligned in certain places. Now, certainly no white supremacy or any of that shit. That side of things is just, you know, when this was being written, Republicans at least stood up against that side of things a lot better than they have in the last 5 years or so. And honestly, you know, the Tea Party really kind of boiled that all up. First with the Islamophobia, and then just more and more of it. Just the kettle's just boiling there, and you know. One of the interesting things in this is at the head of each chapter, he has a little, you know, what would seem like a quote type thing there, but I think these are all just him saying things, and they're not being quoted to anyone or anything. They're just like, some of them are maxims, like here, in war planning you must anticipate the actions of the enemy, be careful lest your preventative measures teach the enemy which of his possible actions you most fear. You know, perfectly reasonable little things. But it does seem kind of funny. It's sort of like he had these little maxims and quotes he wanted to put in from him, and just put them all in his chapter headings. Instead of looking up, you know, clever things that aligned with his thoughts from other thinkers, or of course, there would be no space for it here, but I think he's done this in others, copying sort of that Dune idea of putting his ideas and then giving them to a fictional character or something along those lines. But yeah, I wanted to talk about this just because it kind of tied in with the shit I've been talking about and thinking about recently. you know, on my walks to the bar or whatever. My walks back, I don't think about, you know, stuff of general interest or of this kind of interest. I don't know what the fuck I think about, but it helps keep me from, you know, dwelling on painful thoughts. So, yeah, this kind of stuff. The other ones, I don't know what the fuck they're weird, emotional, and yeah. All right, I'll send this up because yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a good answer as to why I do these. Some people said, hey, you should do more book reviews, I don't know, discussions, I don't know. And Faulkner's who I keep thinking of, yeah. He's no Faulkner. But, yeah, Faulkner was the first one that I did this with, and there's something you can talk about, you know, from a literary standpoint from it. From this, there isn't. It's just, you know, it's good storytelling. That's all. What more can you say? You can't dig into the way he words things. That's not terribly clever. It's just good. It comes across. It gives you the excitement of the action that's going on. This had a little bit too much, for my taste, of that sort of. But it's the type of, you know, the. Sort of military action movie type stuff. Writing that is of that style that I just, you know, that's not where my biggest pleasure comes from. But he did a fine job of it, and I find myself reading things like that sometimes, you know, just because they're what I pick up, even if it's not what I'm totally most into. Usually books like this, on this kind of subject, go right back up to the little free library after I'm done with them. But because it's card, I'm going to keep at least one copy of it. Probably both, because I think mine's in better shape if I have it. I don't know. Anyway, up she goes.